Good evening and welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening for what I think will be a wonderful program. I'm Chancellor George Blumenthal, and welcome to the 15th Annual Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture. This lecture series began 15 years ago, and it was founded by Anuluther Maitra, whom you'll hear from in just a few minutes. And she started it in order to honor her husband, her late husband, Sid. Sid Maitra was a scientist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist, a man of great vision. This annual lecture is a wonderful legacy and preserves Sid's memory while expanding our horizons. The Maitra Lecture is a key UC Santa Cruz event that enriches our intellectual life. In fact, the intellectual life of the entire campus, and as well as the community at large. Sid Maitra himself was a technologist with a deep appreciation of the humanities. And tonight, we celebrate the humanities and all that makes us human. Sometimes humanities can get lost in our high-tech, obsessed society. But really, more important than ever, especially in our high technology society, humanities are something that we have to consider. And I'm delighted to tell you that the humanities are alive and well at UC Santa Cruz. There are abundant opportunities for undergraduates to conduct research, and let me give you just one example. When one of our students, Helen Porter, first arrived at UC Santa Cruz, the last thing she expected to find herself doing was to be in Japan, researching the history behind 200 photos taken in 1952 by an Army dentist, Captain Charles Gale. But she worked with history professor Alan Christie, and Helen became immersed in the story. And now, after graduating, she is the co-director of the Gale Project, a collaborative social history that explores the long history of the United States' presence in Okinawa. The Gale Project emphasizes hands-on research by undergraduates and serves as an innovative platform for new educational methods. And that's just one example of the many rich opportunities for humanity research and scholarship at UC Santa Cruz. Now, to tell you more about the humanities at UC Santa Cruz, let me introduce our Dean of Humanities, Tyler Stovall. Dean Stovall joined us last spring from UC Berkeley, but he is no stranger to this campus. In fact, he was a history faculty member here for 13 years, and he served as the department chair and as the provost of Stevenson College. He specializes in modern French history with a focus on transnational history, labor, colonialism, and race. He is a strong advocate for the humanities, a champion of the distinctive strengths of this campus, our commitment to undergraduate education, as well as strengths in research, interdisciplinary scholarship, and graduate education. Originally, Tyler was from Columbus, Ohio, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Harvard University and an MA in European history from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he went on to receive a PhD in modern European and French history with a minor in Latin American studies. He is the author of several books, numerous articles in the field of modern French history. When Dean Stovall first arrived on campus last April as dean, he said, and I quote, "The humanities are central to the intellectual life of the 21st century." And I bet he still feels that way. Please join me in welcoming Dean Tyler Stovall.
Thank you, Chancellor Blumenthal, for that kind introduction. I'm actually already working in the humanities essential to the intellectual life of the 22nd century. So yes. So this is a wonderful evening. There's all sorts of things to be said about the work that humanist scholars are doing on this campus. From the undergraduates that are working on projects like the Gale Project, to graduate students who are developing cutting-edge ideas about their own fields, to our faculty, whose books win numerous prizes, who are training students at both undergraduate and graduate levels, and playing a central role in their professional societies. I want to speak in the very little time I have here about an organization at Santa Cruz that perhaps more than any other brings all of this work together. The Institute for Humanities Research, the IHR, is an organization that's relatively new on campus, but has pioneered in bringing together scholars from all different parts of campus to look at what makes us all human, ultimately. Sponsors different kinds of research projects, sponsors applications for grants, brings together students and faculty around a wide range of common intellectual pursuits. One of its pursuits, for example, now, is a new project on training both undergraduates and especially graduate students in the humanities to look at how they can use their scholarship and the skills they develop in this scholarship beyond the walls of the ivory tower, beyond academia. What kind of impact they could have on creating the world in the 21st century and beyond. I wanted to acknowledge the director and associate director of the Institute for Humanities Research, Professor Nathaniel Deutsch and Irena Polic. If you would please stand and take a bow. It is their tireless work that has made this event possible. So I wanted to thank all of you for coming and remind you that as you came in, you should have been given a white card. At the end of the talk by Dr. Adams, we are going to have a question and answer period, so please, during the talk, write down any questions you can have, if you have, on the card, pass them to the usher, and I will try and read as many as I can to Dr. Adams. So, thank you for coming, and it is now my pleasure to introduce a great benefactor of UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Unintended Maitra is not only the founder of the Maitra Lectures, but a very dedicated advocate of UC Santa Cruz. Somebody who has served on the UC Santa Cruz Foundation and is a past president of the foundation, who is a major scholar and economist in her own right, and in spite of all her many achievements, has never forgotten to make time for us in Santa Cruz. So I wanted to thank you all for coming and to welcome Dr. Unintended Maitra.
Thank you, Chancellor Blumenthal and Dean Stovall. We have indeed had a sparkling array of Maitra lectures here, and the reputation of the series virtually guarantees a capacity audience in this, the largest auditorium on campus. And I believe that the charm of the series is that we select and present distinguished public intellectuals who are autonomous, original thinkers. William D for Bro, Adams, is the chairman of the National Endowment of the Humanities, NEH. And in the spirit of the broad disciplinary area for which he represents the public face of our government, I decided to trace, as well as I could, the origins and the history of the man. He dropped out of school at 19 and enlisted in the army, going on to serve for 3 years, including a year in Vietnam. Then he performed in drill jargon and about face, returning to Colorado College, where he met the philosopher J. Glenn Gray, who became his mentor. For his doctorate, I'm happy to report that he came to UC Santa Cruz to work in the History of Consciousness department, and his dissertation was titled, "Digging in the Same Place an essay in the political and social philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. You might be tempted to ask, say, who? And I have to admit that I had not heard of him, but now I affectionately call him MMP. MMP was the first phenomenologist to engage with the sciences, and Brough argued in his thesis that political and social philosophy must seek new methodologies and new orientations in order to solve the pressing problems of our contemporary world. In his career march, he followed slightly different drill commands, but also with spectacular conclusion. His initial teaching appointments were in political philosophy, and at Stanford, he taught Western Civ, coordinated the Great Works in Western Culture program, and steered the core curriculum through to its current global form. Stanford was also where he initiated a change step, joining literature professor Bill Chase as he left to become the president of Wesleyan University in Connecticut. From then on, it was a double-time march for Brough. After a 5-year stint at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, he served as president of Colby College, Maine, the years 2000 to 2014. He was a very successful president in many ways, but I'd like to single out his amped-up institutional focus on neuroscience and environmental sciences for their focus on contemporary problems requiring interdisciplinary perspectives. In July 2014, he was appointed the 10th chair of NEH, and he thus accepted from our nation's commander-in-chief the directive to generally support humanities projects and programs. His signature program is a common good, Humanities in the Public Square, and organized around a number of complex contemporary issues, it will enhance the scope and significance of humanities in public life. So, who is this man who trained with an African-American platoon from Detroit, has the ultimately endearing name Brough, and who should be black, who went from soldier with a crew cut to ponytail doctoral student, and I've seen pictures, to NEA chairman with just the right length hair, who speaks with impeccably accented NPR interviewers for his day job, and then rides his carbon bike home to whip up a gourmet meal while listening to the distinctive growl of David Waits, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. Undoubtedly, like Arjuna of the Mahabharata, Brough also heard among the sturm and drang of war something like the Gita, the song of celestial wisdom. But I also believe that his scholarship, which traces an impressive lineage from MMP to the earliest Gestalt philosophers, has played a defining role in his analytical, articulation, communication skills, and also, most importantly, on the ethical foundations of his work and life choices. Mindful of MMP's commandment that an observer reflects the observed, and the observer's perception cannot be defined unless both are integrated within the same environment, I must ask today, how does Brough connect to the vision and the mission of the Maitra series? My husband, Sidhartha Maitra, started college the same year as Brough, but it was in a place far away from here, and his uninterrupted career path in electrical engineering and his personal choices could not have been more different. Unabashed technologist and entrepreneur, unapologetic atheist, math lover, and intrepid adventurer. But born from ashes and grief and inspired by his values and personality is this series, one that I believe is a manifestation of what Brough believes in and seeks to do. The topics range across all scholastic disciplines, including, and importantly, all humanities. They have included darlings of any art division, the poet Vikram Seth, who brought to us perfectly metered verse on friendship that quietly, gently touched the soul, whatever that is, and Satyajit Ray's exquisite films, which stirred the heart, whatever that is. Philosophers like Amartya Sen and Wade Davis, who asked, "Who are we?" questions such as in the tyranny of identity and why ancient wisdom matters. Opera director Peter Sellers, who sees things through the MMP lens and told us that the finest expression of love is longing, found in absence of the loved one, and the quest for what is missing on the canvas gives birth to the finest paintings. Distinguished public intellectuals who brought critical thinking skills to bear on modern sociopolitical issues such as global warming, terrorism, nuclear weapons, so that we could effectively participate in Bro's public square. But Maitra speakers have also been fierce advocates for social justice, and they seek novel ways, as Abraham Verghese put it, to keep alive our humanity, integrity, and empathy. So may I pose a challenge to Bro. Oxfam's recent report showed that just 62 people, 53 of them men, own as much wealth as the poorest half of the entire world population. And the richest 1% own more than the other 99% put together. The next wave of technological innovation, the fourth industrial revolution, threatens further social upheaval. UCSC is a Hispanic-serving institution, proud of its large numbers of first-in-family to go to college, committed to gender equality. Many of our students will graduate saddled with school loans. How do we persuade them to select a humanities major when there is no indication that the US or even the world economy will, anytime soon, have the absorptive capacity to employ them? However, the report also shows a record gap of trust between the informed public and the mass of the people, with the gap widest in the US. Should we then not be training our students to analyze, articulate, communicate, and engage, particularly the last, so as to reverse the current trends of income and wealth distribution? Maybe an interdisciplinary approach with a grasp of Gini coefficients, a recognition of the responsibilities of citizenship, and a cultivation of empathy will work the magic. Maybe. But perhaps we need a new paradigm with new methods, something like a grand consilience that biologist E.O. Wilson has argued for, and that Bro suggested in his doctoral thesis. Inspired by the Rubin vase that you see there, and I hope you've stared at it long enough to see the multi-stability of a vase with two faces looking at each other. I'm not sure this was done properly. I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to. Oh, yeah, well, it's not exactly right, but you're supposed to see a vase. I mean, many of you are familiar with the Rubin vase, and it's a vase in the middle, and then when you see the outlines, it's two profiles looking at each other, and I'm sorry it wasn't executed exactly right. You can see it? Okay. Oh, wonderful. I guess the perspective matters. I can't see it very well from here. So this is the classic Gestaltian example of stability, of multi-stability. And thinking about this new paradigm, I tried to bring closer and closer the two profiles facing each other, the humanities and the sciences, Bro and Sid, so that they could almost kiss each other. But their noses always got in the way. And so it's something I've been thinking about, but maybe our guest, Professor Donald Knuth, who is the father of computer science algorithms, and who's right now working on ancient Sanskrit poetry that contains sophisticated mathematical concepts. Maybe he can set his mind to this and suggest something for the next Maitra lecture. Bro, we are honored by your presence today. And I hope you are convinced that the Maitra series is a worthy enterprise, deserving of your participation and approval. May I therefore acknowledge the producers, the distributors, and the consumers. UCSC and its very humane leader, the astrophysicist, Chancellor George Blumenthal, who, in spite of his manic schedule, has barely missed a Maitra lecture. Dean of Humanities, Tyler Stovall, who initiated the event with an invitation to Bro, and his development director, Carrie Napolis, who executed so ably on this. Nathaniel Deutsch and Irena Polic, whom we've already met, of the Institute of Humanities Research. Suze Howells and Christine Palmer of Special Events of the UR's Special Events Office. Kiran and Arjun Malhotra, who generously provided the major endowment in memory of their friend. And you, the audience, which always includes my close friends and family. And this year, my daughter and my husband are also here. And I'm not sure what MMP or Peter Sellers would advise us to do if you had been missing and the hall empty. So with that, while we together seek the answers, I think we just want to hold on.
Well, the moon was gold, her hair like wind. Said, don't look back, just come on, Jim. Oh, you got to hold on, hold on. You got to hold on, take my hand, standing right here, you got to hold on.
I don't know who told you about Tom Waits. It must have been someone who knows me very well. Wow. Good evening, everyone. It's such a great thrill to be here. And Anu, I want to thank you for those lovely remarks and that terrific introduction. I want to express my own thanks to a few people who are here tonight, beginning with Chancellor Blumenthal for the invitation, along with Nathaniel Deutsch, the Institute for Humanities Research, and the UC Santa Cruz Foundation. I also want to say how helpful Irena Polic has been in making all of the arrangements for this visit. And finally, I want to say, Anu, how deeply honored I am to be associated with this extraordinary Maitra lecture series. I want especially to thank you, Anna, for sharing with me in advance some of your thoughts about the lecture, which helped me prepare my own thinking. I also don't want to pass up this, I think, unique and maybe last opportunity that I'll ever have to say how grateful I am for the education that I received here at Santa Cruz. I've been fortunate to attend some wonderful institutions in my life, but in terms of intellectual depth and impact, nothing came close to the experience I had here. I was well prepared when I arrived, and I was lucky to be here at a particularly interesting time in the life of the university and indeed of the country. But I know I also benefited enormously from the university's core commitments to teaching and to liberal learning. I want to talk some tonight about those commitments as they relate to broader issues within the humanities. But I want to note at the outset the special importance of this place in my own development. I'm particularly grateful to the exceptional teachers I had while I was here, some of whom are here tonight. And I'm also glad and very grateful to see friends from that time in the audience. I learned a lot from you as well. So 2015 and 2016 were seasons of 50th anniversary celebrations, both here and in Washington. And in addition to Santa Cruz and the National Endowment for the Humanities, we have been celebrating there and elsewhere the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration Act, and the Social Security amendments, to name just a few of the extraordinary legislative achievements of that remarkable time. On a more somber but enormously relevant note, the U.S. Congress recently commemorated the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Vietnam War, which changed the American university and the country forever. The founding of the NEH and of Santa Cruz have much more in common than temporal proximity. Both were expressions of the progressive legislative impulses of the mid-1960s, and they shared a vision of the humanities and of liberal education. That vision was severely tested by the turmoil of the 1960s and 70s and by the deep changes in the academy and in American life in subsequent years. I want to talk about how those changes continue to resonate in our own lives against the backdrop of our overlapping histories. A few months before his retirement in 1974, and some of you in the audience will remember this with me, the founding chancellor of Santa Cruz, Dean Mchenry, gave a campus farewell address before a large and noisy audience of faculty and students. It was a memorable performance, not least for Mchenry's calm demeanor in the presence of the critical energy in the room. This was, after all, the 1970s at Santa Cruz. I also recall Mchenry's irrepressible excitement as he recalled the moment when campus construction started in 1964 and the dream of Santa Cruz at last became a physical reality. I'm sure that I don't need to remind this audience that Santa Cruz was something of a utopian moment in the California Master Plan for Higher Education. Dean Mchenry and his Stanford roommate Clark Kerr were members of the task force that created that plan, which became California law in the Donahoe Higher Education Act of 1960. What you may not know is that just 3 years later, another task force, the Commission on the Humanities, began its work in New York. Clark Kerr was also a member of that group, which proposed the creation of a National Humanities Foundation. That recommendation led eventually to the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act, which Lyndon Johnson signed into law on September 29th, 1965. Dean Mchenry and Clark Kerr, in very much the same ways, were deeply concerned about the trajectory of the modern research university and the future of undergraduate education. Their concern was directed in part to the sheer scale and complexity of the modern university, but they were also worried, and even more worried, I think, about its coherence. The traditional ideal of the liberal arts and the education of the whole person were giving way, in their view, to the fragmenting demands for technical training in the natural sciences, engineering, and other technical and professional disciplines. They feared that the multiversity, as Clark Kerr famously called it, would have increasing difficulty presenting a balanced and coherent curriculum to undergraduates. They also worried about faculty incentives. In a prescient passage from his influential manifesto on higher education, The Uses of the University, Kerr notes that, quote, more instruction falls to teachers who are not members of the regular faculty. There seems to be a point of no return after which research, consulting, graduate instruction becomes so absorbing that faculty efforts can no longer be concentrated on undergraduate instruction as they once were. Members of the Commission on the Humanities in New York had their own related concerns about the place of the humanities in the intellectual landscape of the country. In February 1965, Frederic Burkhardt, then president of the American Council of Learned Societies, testified before Congress on the proposed legislation for NEH. Here's a little piece of that revealing testimony. In science, he says, we have done well, but there is now a widespread concern that the emphasis on science has produced an imbalance in our civilization, and specifically in our educational system, where much of the vast amount provided for the support of science and research has been invested. there has been no comparable investment in the humanities and the arts, and in consequence, the education of our young, including our young scientists, run the risk of becoming narrowly technical and short-sighted. A lopsided, half-starved educational system is simply something this country cannot afford. However strong in technology, however strong in defense and wealth, science itself will suffer in such an environment. Curren Mchenry, both of them were skeptical that the university system and its flagship campuses could ever provide, again, an integrated and balanced social and intellectual experience for undergraduates. But he held out the hope that a new public institution, dedicated from the outset to outstanding liberal education, could. Kerr writes, if there are to be new departures near the end of the uses of the university, they are most likely to come on the campuses of those old private universities and on the totally new campuses of the state universities in America. The California campus, where a new departure might be possible, was, of course, this one, Santa Cruz. It was here, in this bucolic setting, that Mchenry and Kerr hoped to counter the growing depersonalization, fragmentation, and professionalization of the multi-university with a unique experiment in public higher education. That experiment, as all of you know, included several key features: a faculty culture explicitly committed to undergraduate teaching, the college system, where both students and faculty would experience intellectual and social community, the de-emphasizing of academic disciplines and departments in favor of college-centered multidisciplinary curricula and boards of studies, the abandonment of grades in favor of narrative evaluations of student performance, and a decisively aprofessional, perhaps even anti-professional bias with regard to the fundamental value and purpose of undergraduate education. It was also notable that the university eschewed intercollegiate athletics in favor of club sports. Banana slugs forever. While much of the founding discussion of Santa Cruz focused on undergraduate education, the founders knew that the university would have to have graduate and professional programs. And it was especially fitting that one of the first such ventures was the History of Consciousness program. For HisCon, as it came to be known, and still is known, was, in its beginning at least, a graduate program that had deep roots in the traditional ideal of liberal learning. During my senior year at Colorado College, I studied with a professor named Harvey Robin, who was, as it turns out, the first graduate of HisCon. He urged me to apply to the program. I was a philosophy major, and in my own limited way, I could see how constraining disciplinary boundaries were to the study of history and to thinking about the contemporary world. Harvey described a place where one could study history and literature, philosophy, art, music, and social science and theory all at once, a place where traditional boundaries of understanding were being dismantled. When I looked around the landscape of graduate programs in philosophy in the fall of 1972, no other place seemed as compelling or exciting. And it didn't hurt that Santa Cruz was in California, on the coast of California. And so what I discovered when I arrived in the fall of 1972 was in many ways true to the advertisements. There was a keen sense that something big and maybe unprecedented was happening in HisCon and at Santa Cruz. Students and faculty alike were pursuing their interests in ambitiously interdisciplinary ways. It didn't seem all that problematic to me at the time that HisCon had no assigned faculty or dedicated courses of its own or requirements of any kind. It was all of a piece with the apparently boundless freedom and formlessness of the times. And there was something else in the air. The idea that the intellectual work we were doing would help sort out the political and social turbulence of the times. It might even help create a better world. As I was thinking about this talk, I went back with some trepidation, I must confess, to my dissertation. I found this passage in the introduction. For this generation of students and teachers, the dissatisfaction with traditional philosophical perspectives and the search for new directions cannot be separated from the political upheavals of the 1960s and early 1970s. In my own experience, and in the experience of the many people I knew and worked with, this connection was decisive. The political crisis grounded and directed our reading and our thinking. It attracted us to innovative thinkers or changed dramatically the way we read classical political and social theorists. In short, it was at times impossible to distinguish between the political and intellectual questions we were asking, for better or worse, and sometimes it was for the worse. Politics and philosophy were the same thing. With the perspective of all the time that has passed since then, it's not difficult for me to see now that for all its progressive impulses, the vision of the humanities that animated HisCon in those very early years, at least, was in certain respects quite traditional. As its name suggests, the program had deep roots in the grand tradition of European thought, and especially in the philosophical tradition that reached its apex in Hegel and in Marx. That tradition was principally concerned with Western cultural heritage, and it was grounded in the notion that human history, in spite of all of its detours and complexities, works more or less steadily toward the unity of human experience and the progressive realization of human freedom. HisCon's historicism, in this sense, was one branch of a fairly widespread academic consensus regarding the humanities in the 1960s. And it was this consensus that the founders of NEH in Santa Cruz certainly shared. It involved a distinctly highbrow view of culture, a canon of great works, a distinctly Western bias, and an educational vision at one with the classical notion of liberal learning. Matthew Arnold was never very far from this picture, neatly captured in the preface to the report of the Commission on the Humanities in this gem from John Adams. Quote, "I studied politics and war that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study philosophy and mathematics, geography, natural history and naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children the right to study painting, poetry, music, and architecture. War and commerce come first. Culture comes later." In part because of its offbeat, innovative character and reputation, Santa Cruz did wonderfully well in its first decades. Applications were strong, and so too was the sense of intellectual community on the campus. In 1972, Santa Cruz was one of the hottest campuses in the UC system, at one with the zeitgeist. But the world started to change in the late 1970s, and the zeitgeist moved on. The country entered a recession, unemployment and inflation rose dramatically, liberal education suddenly looked frivolous. This should sound familiar. Applications fell, and the university had no choice but to think beyond the founding vision and framework of liberal education. These pressures were amplified by the beginning of a backlash against the counterculture of the 1960s, which was part of the Santa Cruz brand. As I think John DeZekis said about this time, Santa Cruz was, quote, "overtaken by history." Richard Broadhead, the president of Duke, has recently argued that at the same time, importantly, Americans' views of the ultimate purposes of government also were changing. The country's experience in Vietnam led to a pervasive skepticism on the left and the right regarding the fundamental integrity and trustworthiness of government. And in California, the success of Proposition 13, as we can see now in the rearview mirror, was a fateful first step in the long unwinding of the Great Society view of government that was essential to the founding of Santa Cruz and the NEH. The humanities also started to change. There was movement away from a primarily Western orientation toward the global and the multicultural, erosion of the authority of the classical Western canon, and indeed the very notion of the canon itself, questioning of the idea of the fundamental unity of human experience across time and cultural difference, and the erosion of the authority of the text. New critical and interpretive methodologies came to the fore, and the language of certain disciplines within the humanities became more technical, abstract, and inaccessible to people beyond the academy. I had a close encounter with some of these changes and their consequences several years after I left Santa Cruz and received my degree. After one-year teaching stints at Chapel Hill and Santa Clara, I was happy to land a position in the Great Works of Western Culture program at Stanford. As some of you know, that program was a year-long core requirement for all first-year Stanford students, and it consisted specifically in a grand multidisciplinary humanities tour through the cultural history of the West by way of the canon of great works, beginning with ancient Greece and concluding at the end of the year with 20th century Europe and the United States. Or as a Stanford colleague liked to call it, Plato to NATO. Shortly after I arrived at Stanford in 1984, the Western Culture program was subjected to intense internal criticism for being too Western, too canonical, too homogeneous. The ensuing debate was rich and intense and provocative, and it concluded in the gradual abandonment of the core list of texts that had provided a common experience for all first-year Stanford students in favor of thematic tracks that had little in common beyond the small writing and reading intensive seminar experience in the humanities. The Stanford Debate, as some of you will remember, was part of a wider set of culture wars that began in the mid-1980s and eventually affected many institutions, including NEH and the NEA. They were punctuated by the publication in the late 1980s of Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind and E.D. Hirsch's Cultural Literacy. At Stanford, a pivotal moment arrived when William Bennett, chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and later Secretary of Education, gave a public lecture and scolded students and faculty for capitulating to political pressures on the campus and for abandoning the great humanities tradition. I was in the audience that day. Little did I know. The changes that were finally made at Stanford, the inclusion of texts outside the conventional canon and the Western tradition, and specifically the addition of works by women and members of underrepresented group, made a huge amount of sense to me at the time, and they make a great deal of sense to me still. Indeed, they were both intellectually viable, sound, and I also think inevitable. But more recent developments at Stanford in the core curriculum and the humanities more generally have caused me to ponder the matter of unintended consequences. For after several additional years and changes to the program, it disappeared. A senior administrator at the university told me recently that the program had come to have so little shared content that it became increasingly difficult to defend. Perhaps more important, as the connective tissue of this common set of texts fell away, and as the elements of a common intellectual experience withered, student satisfaction with the course plummeted, and that was the final straw. Today at Stanford, as at most institutions, the numbers of humanities enrollments and majors are declining steadily. Meanwhile, there are now, incredibly, 1,000 computer science majors at Stanford, with no end in sight. It's not unreasonable to wonder what the loss of a core curriculum in the humanities and a humanities requirement may have done to diminish student appetite for the humanities generally, and whether or not we should re-examine the idea of core requirements in the humanities. What happened at Santa Cruz in the 1980s and a little bit later at Stanford foreshadowed, of course, things to come across the country. Economic recession causes anxiety among students and parents regarding career preparation and the relevance of higher education to getting a job. Colleges and universities respond reasonably with marketing and curricular adjustments that emphasize career training and relevance. There is a rush to disciplines and programs perceived as useful. Disciplines and programs perceived as marginal to the economy struggle to maintain student interest and institutional resources. But several things, separately and in combination, are distinctly different now, and here's a partial short list. No one could have imagined 20 years ago the power and press of science and technology, especially information technology, on our daily lives and on the economy generally. The resulting elevation of STEM disciplines is likewise unprecedented. We are indeed living in the time of STEM. The severity, secondly, of the economic downturn of 2008 and 9 was also unprecedented. Fully 7 years later, the country and the world are still recovering. In part because of that downturn, and on top of the contraction of government generally, most public universities are profoundly challenged by the withering of state and federal support for higher education. This means that there are fewer resources for everyone, as Chancellor Blumenthal certainly knows, but especially for the arts and humanities. What's more, the downward pressure on the humanities, enrollments, majors, and career opportunities are more severe than in previous cycles. I visited at least 24 public and private universities in the last year and a half, and it's not uncommon to hear, especially at public institutions, even Tier 1 public institutions, of humanities enrollment reductions between 20 and 40% in just the last few years. Even elite private universities find themselves struggling to come to terms with the profound changes in student aspirations and behavior. Surrounding all of this is the distinctly sour turn in the public mood regarding the worth of the humanities in education and beyond. I am sure that we were all struck by the recent spectacle of a leading candidate for his party's presidential nomination recently disparaging philosophers in the very public setting of a presidential debate. Indeed, he may be doing it again right now. And here is the deep and fascinating irony of where we are. At the very moment the humanities are being pressured in the academy and disparaged in public places, the country is wrestling with challenges that need the humanities more than ever. The most important challenges of our times, the really big things we live with, the wicked problems of the country and our time, can't be intelligently approached and described, never mind resolved, without the full engagement of the sensibilities and habits of mind and forms of knowledge that are fostered by humanistic inquiry, teaching, and learning. By way of example, just start with technology itself. We know in an existential and maybe somewhat inchoate way that our personal and professional lives have changed enormously in the wake of the intrusion of everything digital. The human consequences of this phenomenon are clearly matters that require a variety of talents and sensibilities that transcend the technology that creates them. We can't grasp the experiential impact of technology without humanities-based questions and perspectives. The ubiquity of technology is also playing a hugely important role in the powerful public debate now before us regarding the appropriate balance between liberty and security. The recent terrorist attacks in this country and around the world have amplified this debate in mostly unhelpful ways. Here's a place where more, not less, philosophy, history, constitutional law, and theory would be enormously useful to everyone. And here's another equally wicked contemporary problem. The breathtaking developments in gene editing technology are raising extraordinarily thorny questions. Owing to the invention of a technology known as CRISPR-Cas9, it's now possible to select certain specific human physical, psychological, and emotional traits and lock them into the human germline, ensuring their heritability. Natural selection thereby becomes human selection, we now have full control of the human genome. What the implications of this new power are, how it is to be applied and controlled, and what values and rules might govern its uses are matters that will concern all of us in one way or another, virtually forever. Some of our wicked problems are neither new nor technologically induced. We've all been reminded by events of the past year how deeply entrenched is the issue of race relations in American life. These events have raised many questions, including questions about rigid patterns of segregation in cities and neighborhoods, questions about policing, and about entrenched forms of inequality. But all of these questions, all of them, work back to the fundamental question of our history. The surprise and dismay that many of us experienced throughout this very long year, the sinking feeling that race relations in this country are in a different and much worse place than we thought, suggests that we do not, in fact, know where we've come from and that we don't really have a good grasp of how we got here. And so the history of race relations in the United States has become relevant in a new and painful way. We're relearning the truth of Faulkner's insight. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. Around the country, college and university students have certainly grasped Faulkner's meaning, perhaps without knowing, I regret to say, any Faulkner. And they're right to insist that the historical record be brought into public discussion. Ironically, some have also suggested that the signpost to that history be removed, which seems to me to be another way of constraining memory, at least for future generations. But the inclination to dig into our history in light of current events is admirable and necessary to the broader prospect of ameliorating race relations in this country. Of course, the topic of race raises cultural as well as historical issues, and so too do events in other parts of the world. In the Middle East and elsewhere, we seem to be perpetually behind the cultural curve of events, especially as those events demand a basic understanding of the ways in which culture motivates actors, nations, tribes, individuals, unaffiliated movements. This raises in turn the broader matter of cultural literacy as an aspect of public life and education. I know that term has been fraught since E.D. Hirsch coined it in the late 1980s, but Hirsch was thinking about cultural literacy in a textual sort of way. I'm thinking about it rather as the understanding of the source and content of our collective identities as Americans or Somalis or Bhutanese, the sort of culture that ethnographers care and think about. It would have been useful in that vein if, when Americans were debating the use of force in Iraq after 9/11, leaders and citizens alike, all of us, had known more, or maybe anything at all, about the differences between Shia and Sunni Islam. It would be enormously useful today if citizens in Kansas and Iowa and Minnesota and Arizona and, of course, California and other places where immigration is changing the shape of the country were able to bridge cultural differences that separate them from their newest neighbors. Cultural literacy in this sense is both about inclination and skills, humanities skills. Martha Nussbaum has talked compellingly about empathy as a vital attribute of democratic citizenship, the stretching of one's emotional range to incorporate others who are different and still nearby. Empathy is one of the several virtues the humanities teach. Other relevant skills belonging uniquely to the humanities include language skills, listening skills, interpretive skills. There is also a knowledge factor here, notwithstanding our very complex internal family arguments about the nature of knowledge in the humanities. There really is something called cultural knowledge, which consists, at least in part, in grasping the inner movements and meanings of various ways of life. Cultural literacy in this sense is an essential piece of what Danielle Allen has called participation readiness in American democratic life. especially in the increasingly complex political, economic, and social context in which we are living. A robust, democratic political culture requires certain core competencies. In addition to cultural literacy, those competencies include at least the acquaintance with the broad contours of our history and a passing understanding of the principles of liberal democracy. I could go on this way for a long time, but I think you see what I mean. Now more than ever, the sensibilities cultivated by the humanities are critical to our public life. Knowing this in the abstract is one thing, of course. Bringing the humanities back into the center of the conversation about the purposes of education is another. So, what is to be done? There is another, perhaps more useful and hopeful irony in our current situation. While humanities scholars and programs find themselves under pressure in the academy and in public opinion, my experience, at least at NEH, suggests that some humanities practices are indeed flourishing in many places beyond the academy. For example, there are now more than 35,000 museums in the United States. These institutions attract approximately 850 million visitors every year, which exceeds attendance for all major league sporting events and theme parks combined. Yes. The American Library Association reports that there are 120,000 libraries of every shape and size in this country. In 2012 alone, over 92 million people attended nearly 4 million programs offered by public libraries. Significant public participation in humanities-based practices continues to flourish in other areas as well. The Public Broadcasting Service estimates that more than 33 million people viewed the initial broadcast of The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, the latest NEH-funded Ken Burns documentary. NEH-funded radio productions reach millions of listeners every day through national public radio and affiliated stations across the country. I know that the academic humanities have different purposes in some ways from the public humanities, but we can learn something here about audience, I think. Because they depend on direct public engagement and support, museums and libraries and public media have had to find ways to speak to and engage audiences in ways that sustain their attention. The academic humanities might find encouragement in some of those practices. There's probably no better place to begin more public-facing humanities work than in addressing the wicked problems that define our contemporary situation. One can imagine tremendously interesting curricular initiatives taking shape around humanities works on these topics, those I mentioned and others. And because the topics are inherently interdisciplinary, humanities scholars would find abundant opportunities for collaborating in new ways in addressing them. Teaching the wicked problems implies new kinds of linkages with humanities, between the humanities and fields outside of the humanities as well. I'm thinking especially of science, engineering, medicine, and business. If it's our reality to occupy the time of STEM, and if it's likely, as I think it is, that resources and students will continue to chase the STEM fields, then we should be demonstrating how that migration is incomplete and maybe incoherent without humanities practitioners who can help us understand the lived, experiential dimensions and implications of the scientific, technical, and professional worlds and ways of knowing. These and still other curricular approaches are important and promising, but we won't be able to make a fully compelling case for the centrality of the humanities or the arts without at the same time re-engaging the ideal of liberal learning. As Clark Kerr and Dean McHenry did in the early 1960s, I think we have to place liberal learning at the forefront of our discussions about the basic purposes of education. For the education of the whole person, as tradition had it, has always been the framework in which the arts and humanities derive their power and relevance. Of course, that way of speaking, the education of the whole person, sounds dated to us, And as Danielle Allen has pointed out, it also invokes the elitist sensibilities that were part and parcel of the ideal of liberal learning for all of the 19th century and much of the 20th as well, when liberal learning was reserved for leaders and social elites. Some of that elitism continues to cling to public perception of the liberal arts in the United States. We need then to seek a more democratic view and expression of liberal learning that focuses on citizenship and the diverse capacities required to be an engaged and informed member of democratic society. At the same time, we can't lose sight of the other dimensions of life where the humanities are so consequential. I'm thinking especially of our personal lives and our interpersonal lives, where all of us seek meaning. The conception of liberal learning and the humanities that I'm arguing for involves a reappropriation of the term pragmatic. The demand that education be useful is not one that we should fear or flee. In the spirit of John Dewey and William James and Richard Rorty, we should be eager to demonstrate that the liberal arts and sciences, and the humanities more specifically, are profoundly useful to the breadth of our experience and challenges as human beings. What I'm invoking here is not our experience as rendered by the natural sciences and the highly quantitative social sciences, though those renderings are enormously important and also useful. The experiencing I'm pointing back to is experience as it is lived out in the world by real people. It's from this domain of lived experience that the humanities ultimately derive their power and significance. They give us access to, and they help us to comprehend our experience in its raw, unmediated, and ultimately inescapable and irreducible form. It will take time and effort to make the case for a pragmatic and democratic view of the liberal arts, to demonstrate it, and to reposition the humanities within such a framework. It will also take experimentation and the compelling examples that experiments provide. Last but certainly not least, it will take decisive action by institutions. Because of its history and because of its DNA, I can't think of a better place than Santa Cruz to show the world what a rejuvenated, contemporary, democratic form of liberal undergraduate education looks like. There is a deep, deep legacy of innovative thinking here and a true understanding of what the education of the whole person means. What a fitting way to celebrate the past, and what an exciting and meaningful way to shape the university's future. Thank you and happy birthday. I'm eager to hear your questions or complaints.
First of all, let me thank again Bro Adams for making what we do seem so important.
It is important.
Okay, so I have a few questions and about 15 minutes, I guess. So I'm just going to read them in order as we have them. First one, Ray Kurzweil is now head of technology at Google. Kurzweil is producing Singularity, predicting Singularity will arrive faster than anticipated. Will Singularity be dystopian? And if so, why or why not?
Whoa. That's maybe a little above my pay grade. Well, I'm not sure all of the meanings of singularity that might be embedded there, but as I alluded to at the end, and in my MMP sort of way, my own view is that sort of we're stuck with the It's sort of the fundamental nature of our experience as we live it in the world. And sooner or later, everything has to refer back to that. And I don't hold out a great deal of hope, or I don't have any expectation that in any of the ways that AI suggests or that computer science suggests, that we're going to be able at some point to create anything like that fundamental phenomenal realm of experience that we live in as human beings. So if that's the meaning of singularity in that case, I don't expect that to happen. But I know that there are people that do, and we'll see.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this question reads, as a secondary school teacher, I encounter too many ahistoric students that are only captivated by the newest technological inventions. I fear that a populace that can be manipulated to disregard scientific warnings about climate change will easily fall prey to false claims of the worthlessness of the humanities and to the politicians creating their own, quote, histories. How can we capture the hearts of the youth so that there will be many more minds that value the humanities before they go to work and or onto higher education?
I think that's the central question. And I've been struggling with it a lot. NEH doesn't have a lot of activity in the space of secondary education. We have a little bit, but not a lot. It's a vast space. It's very complicated. It is all bound up with regional and local culture and politics. It's very, very complex. But my fear is that if we don't create rich, liberal learning settings and experiences in secondary education, it's going to be very hard to turn it around when people get to us, to you. I had a very interesting meeting the other day with a foundation nearby, and we were talking about messaging, and is it we who are sending messages to secondary school teachers and administrators who then narrow the scope of what they're doing in order to meet the expectations they think we're setting? Or are we adjusting to the students that come to us in the ways that the question suggests? I think there is a lot of messaging from higher education, and I think it's important that we understand that. This recent report that came out from Harvard, I think, was a very good first step in reminding us how much messaging there is and how powerful it is. And at NEH, we have much greater impact and engagement with that sector, so I think what I'm going to try to focus on is messaging there, even as I understand that as parents and citizens, we all have relationships with secondary education, certainly public education. And so I think we have to be working in those places and fields as well, demanding a certain kind of aspiration within these educational settings. So that's the big question. How do we reopen this conversation about the purposes of education and what we're trying to do fundamentally with young people? And we've got to have that conversation at every level.
Okay, this next question well, it's actually not really a question, sort of a comment, but it's an acronym question. The writer says there's STEM and then there's STEAM. I suppose you could also say there's STEAM as well. But asks specifically, are the arts going to change, bring a change in terms of how we regard STEM?
Are the arts going to change?
Yes.
I like to hear STEAM, and I'm very supportive of the arts and my colleagues in Washington and the arts in pushing that arts education agenda along with STEM. I think it's great. I think we have to go deeper and we have to back up further than that. I don't think it's just appending an A or an H to the STEM disciplines. I think it's going back again to this very fundamental question. What are we trying to do? What are our aspirations in the educational context for our young people? And what are we trying to make happen there? And so I resist a little bit the appendage of an A or an H as the kind of fundamental answer to this. I don't think it is the answer, though I'm supportive of it whenever I hear it, and I admire our colleagues in the arts for, that clever moment. But I want to have a broader conversation, and I think we have to have a broader conversation. We just can't be appending things to other things.
Okay, the next question is, for undergraduates who are committed to the humanities but don't see how their studies will connect them with jobs, what are your suggestions?
Well, I had this problem. I was a liberal arts college president, so I talked about this all the time. And I think there are multiple ways in which we can talk about the professional relevance of the humanities and the ways in which the humanities do prepare students for all kinds of professional settings and roles. I'm sure you all talk about them too. I think that's an important conversation to have, and it begins with certain fundamental intellectual capacities, communication, thinking, writing, reading, all of those deep humanities capabilities that the humanities nurture and that are hugely relevant in professional settings. Martha Nussbaum's conversation about empathy, I think, is another one that's very important, and the other kind of virtues that are instilled by the humanities. All of that has professional relevance. But education is not just about work preparation. And if you permit the conversation to be just about that, it's not going to be a very satisfying conversation. The other, and I tried to indicate the other dimensions of this. The political and the democratic one is, of course, hugely important and fundamental. That has to be a central part of the way we think about our aspirations for education. And so too is the existential, that place where we spend most of our time, all day long and much of the night. No. And of course, the humanities are deeply invested in representing and revealing that dimension and the ways in which we all succeed and fail and struggle and live in those places. And those places are hugely important. And that's got to be part of the picture, too.
Okay, I think we have time for a few more. This writer writes, many in the tech world would agree with your argument in favor of cultural literacy and critical thinking. However, they seem to believe that these kinds of skills don't require formal teaching. Techies are often autodidacts about, quote, easy stuff like humanities. How then do we make the case for humanities classrooms?
Well, I think you have to talk about the richness and complexity of the material itself. And, this stuff doesn't just come by osmosis. Whether you're talking about history or philosophy or language is a great example. Anybody who's trying to learn a second language knows what I'm talking about. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and concentration in work and the development of very specific skills. And so do many of these other sort of humanities perspectives on the world. It takes good teaching, it takes mentoring, it takes time, it takes exposure, it takes discipline. So I just think you have to talk specifically and concretely about what we know about those things.
Okay, here's a somewhat related comment. How do we combat the widespread notion that all problems have technical solutions?
Well, I run into problems that don't have technical solutions sort of hourly. And that's one of the great things about deep work in the humanities is that it's mostly about those dimensions of our lives that are not technical. You think another way to talk about this wicked problem matter is that most of the great challenges that we face in this country now are not technical. They're problems that have to do with history, culture, values, and ideas. And that's where they live. They have technical dimensions, certainly. But ultimately, they live in those spaces
where the humanities also live and where that kind of thinking also lives. So I think we just have to talk about the problems themselves, or the challenges or the opportunities, however you want to pitch it. But that's the way to demonstrate that these are not technical issues. Boy, the world is so abundantly full of things that are not technical. So.
Okay, 2 more questions. First, can you speak about how K through 12 education in humanities can be strengthened so all high school graduates can value human commonalities and diversity?
I think one thing that we've got to do is back away from the testing regime that has become so ubiquitous in the country. I understand accountability, I understand assessment, I understand that's very important. But we've gone way, way over the edge on this. And even, the Secretary of Education conceded this fairly recently in Washington, saying that they regretted the ways in which they had amplified this anxiety about testing. So we've got to back away from testing. Mm-hmm. And again, we have to instill, we have to have this conversation about all of the dimensions in which we're trying to fortify the capacities of young people to live the lives that they will live, which are ultimately whole lives. They're extended lives. They're extended into professional space, but they're also extended into political space and into personal and interpersonal space. And those are the things that we should be talking about and paying attention to.
Okay. This final question I think you've already addressed, but I think because it's so important it's worth repeating. How can we best connect humanities and academia with the broader public?
Well, as I've been saying, I think there are plenty of what I call public-facing humanities questions that do resonate deeply with the public and that are identifiable as real, significant, obvious public issues. And I think there are abundant opportunities for humanities scholars, writers, activists to engage those questions in all kinds of ways. I think there are lots of opportunities for institutions to do that too, and to create spaces where those kinds of engagements, public engagements, can happen. The Humanities Center movement around the country in higher ed has been very devoted to that. I think that's very important, where community engagement becomes an avenue of humanities work. And I think those are very helpful things. We started a new program at NEH called the Public Scholar Program, which some of you might have heard of, in our research program. And the whole purpose of that was to incentivize humanities scholars to produce work that is accessible to much broader domains of the public. And I think, and I mentioned it in my talk, I think we did do some narrowing of language and in the humanities and theorizing in the humanities in ways that made public access very, very difficult. So we have to speak about public things in ways that can be understood in the public. And that doesn't mean to make them simple or to be reductive about them. It means we have to speak straightforwardly and meaningfully about them. So we have to be self-aware in that way as well. But I think if we are, and if we join in the right kinds of conversations, people will recognize it as relevant. Meanwhile, of course, there are mountains of things that humanists do that are always quite technical and narrowly, focused. You think about, work in, ancient, in and around ancient civilizations, and very, very focused technical questions of deep history. Those are things that are beautiful and valuable, and we need to protect them and support them. So I'm not saying that everything becomes public, everything becomes accessible to masses of people. But there are lots of things that could be more accessible if we found forms of language and address that are more inviting to broader elements of the public.
Okay, let me just end by saying I hope this evening's discussion will be the beginning of many other discussions between all of us at Santa Cruz, between people at Santa Cruz and the NEH, and part of a national dialogue on why the humanities are important. Thank you so much for coming back to Santa Cruz.